Hi, my name's Bill Gordon. I just wanted to have a chat to you today about some things related to spray application and drift management, particularly with ground application. That's the area I tend to specialise in. I do a lot of work with the grains industry and the cotton industry here in Australia. A little bit about spraying capacity, how that's changed in recent times, particularly in the last decade or so. A little bit on the label changes that are coming in with the new registrations, and possibly over time we'll see these across all products. A small amount on how the nozzles work, particularly the ones that are available now, how we can use those as part of managing drift. And also, I guess the focus is some of the things related to weather conditions and spraying and the risks associated with temperature inversions. So just to mention, spraying capacity has changed. We're seeing a lot more self-propelled sprayers and also larger ground rigs coming into the market. Now these have the capability to cover a lot more hectares per hour. So you think about the changes that have happened in the last 10 years or so. The thing that we've introduced is guidance, which now allows spraying day or night. Tank sizes have increased. It's quite common to have a 4,000 litre tank. It'd be small now. Some machines run up to 10,000 litre tanks. The boom widths, or how wide the machine sprays, is usually 36 metres or more. Some of them are running 42 metres at the moment. You can even get 48 on some. And the travel speeds have increased enormously with machine stability. Most sprayers now travel around 20 kilometres an hour or above, but there's a number that are operating closer to 30 or higher, particularly in fallow situations. Do you ever think about what that means? I guess with a sprayer travelling at 22 kilometres an hour with a 36 metre boom, they can easily cover 60 hectares per hour. Many of the sprayers in the larger areas where we've got wide open downs are doing 80, sometimes 100 hectares per hour. Now that's more than twice what they were doing about 10 years ago. So each hour they're leaving twice as much chemical in the air. And if that's done under the wrong conditions, the risk is much higher. And obviously with higher travel speeds, there's more risk that stuff will be left in the air as well. So as a response to some of these changes, the APVMA, the federal government that approves products for labels, have been making changes to label statements, and these are in response to their spray drift risk assessments process that started about 8 or 10 years ago. And what that means is that on the label they include changes like required spray qualities. This means they talk about a droplet size that you have to use, define wind speed ranges. Usually there's a minimum wind speed and a maximum wind speed, and then there's a new thing called no spray zones, which is basically a downwind buffer. So if the wind is blowing towards what they consider to be a sensitive area, you can't spray within a certain distance. And there's also some additional record keeping requirements written into the labels now to overcome the differences between the states. So one of the statements that might apply or appear on the label is one saying do not apply with spray droplets smaller than a certain size. So with a lot of herbicides that would be coarse, with a lot of insecticides that would be medium. Now when we talk about spray quality, it's actually to a certain standard. It's either an American standard, which is the ASABE S572.1, but they also accept a British standard. Essentially these standards appear on the manufacturer's charts for nozzles that I'll talk about in a moment. The wind speed restraints that I mentioned, it says do not apply when the wind speed is less than 3 or more than 20 kilometres per hour as measured at the site of application. So everyone has to have some sort of handheld weather meter or weather instrument in the paddock where they're spraying. Some labels still say 3 to 15. But the other statements included in there is a really important one which says do not apply during surface temperature inversion conditions at the site. Now there's a lot of documentation in the packs that I've sent for Bryn to give out to you. One's on a weather book written by Graham Tepper, but there's also a fact sheet there on surface temperature inversions, which is a plain English version of what's on the APVMA website. It says that growers should anticipate that there will be a surface temperature inversion every night between sunset and sunrise, unless it's raining, there's really heavy low-level cloud or the wind speed remains above 11 kilometers an hour for the entire night. So generally in most situations this means it's almost illegal to spray at night, and this will have implications for obviously beekeepers who would prefer growers spray at night, but it's not always going to be a legal thing to do. The no spray zones that I mentioned, principally there's 4 areas that the APVM are looking at: areas occupied by people, aquatic areas, terrestrial vegetation, which includes sensitive crops, native vegetation, that type of stuff, and pastures. So what they're looking at is protecting human health, the environment, but also trade in terms of possible residues. Now you'll note there's absolutely no reference to bees in the no spray zones, and that could be an area that you guys perhaps lobby the APVMA to get recognition in the no spray zones for hives. It's probably something you should consider. To give an example of a label where this would apply, this is Movento, a fairly new insecticide. It's a systemic one that can actually move up and down in the plant, and it's been used for whitefly, aphids, scales, pests in cotton, but also some veggies. And under its mandatory no spray zone, says don't apply if there are livestock or pasture or any land producing feed for livestock downwind of the application area within the distance shown in the table. So for ground application it's a very small buffer, only 10 metres. With air blast it's up to 80. You may note on some products that downwind buffer may be up to 300 metres. Essentially anything beyond 300 metres during a daytime application, you would anticipate that the product will generally dilute sufficiently if the wind's enough. But that may change. For instance, if there was aerial application, then that distance could be over a kilometre. So what I'm going to jump to next is just a little bit on the application technology itself. Obviously the nozzle plays a big role in controlling the output of the sprayer. So the nozzle controls flow rate, makes the pattern and creates the droplets, and it is controlled by, I guess, the pressure that it's run through. It will affect the droplet size. And with most modern machines, they run automatic rate controllers which adjust the pressure automatically to match the speed so they can keep their litres per hectare constant. So when picking a nozzle, we need to establish the type that will give the droplet size or spray quality that we want. So there are a range of different nozzles on the market, and most applicators will generally have a couple of different types. The standard flat fan in the top left really is not used that much anymore because it creates generally fine droplets. Most label requirements now say a fine or a medium. So we have a range of nozzle styles there, including what we call pre-orifice, and also air induction types. Generally they're colour coded for flow rate, and that's purely just a process of matching the size that'll give you the flow rate or litres per hectare you want at the speed that you're travelling at. The other thing that you can look up is this spray quality information. So on this table we have for one nozzle type, over on the left a turbo T-jet. Below that are a series of colours: orange, green, yellow, lilac, blue, red. That's to do with the nozzle size, which will give you the flow rate. Then on the right part of the table we have pressure across the top in bar. So 1 bar equals about 15 psi, and then at each pressure it shows a spray quality, or what we're talking about is a droplet size. So we talk about droplet size now in terms of spray quality, and I'll go through what that means in terms of drift at the moment. But with any nozzle, as you increase the pressure, when you move from left to right on that chart, increasing the pressure generally makes the droplet size smaller, and that will give you more drift risk. This is I guess a chart that shows the cut-offs for each of the spray quality classifications. Now it's a little bit difficult to read, but on the left hand side on the vertical axis you will have droplet size in microns, and across the bottom we have a fraction of what the sprayer puts out that'll be in a certain size. So if I was to read that, if I identified the C in the middle, you can see that each line has 3 points, so they make 3 measurements. If we go across to the little crosses above the point 1 and line it up with the C in the middle for the cutoff for coarse, you'll see that point 1 between the blue and purple bars for C lines up at about 150 microns. So what that tells us is about 10% of what we put out will be under 150 microns in size, about 50% will be under 350 microns, and the 90% will be under 600 to 700 microns. It's that 10% fraction that's really important, that number, because it gives us an idea of what the drift is. So 10% under 150 microns means that 10% of the spray put out by that nozzle or by that sprayer fitted with those nozzles is capable of moving with the wind or evaporating and shifting off site. So if they don't hit the target straight away, you've got about 10% at risk with a course. And if you have a look at what each of those spray quality classification means in simple terms, roughly each time you change spray quality to a larger size, you halve the drift potential. So if you look at a standard flat fan from years ago, it had 40 to 50% of what it puts out in droplet sizes that could move with the wind. When you move to a medium, you cut that down to about 20%. Moving to a coarse spray quality, it's less than 10. Very coarse, less than 5, and so on. And if you looked at the coarse, the one in the middle for example, of that 10% that it puts out, under normal conditions only about 1 to 2% of that would actually leave the field. But if the sprayer's operating at high speed and the boom's quite high, you'll increase that amount of the 10% that could move. So in a high speed spraying situation, boom's sitting, a metre in the air or a metre above the top of the stubble, you might leave most of that 10% in the air and greatly increase the risk. So I wanted to take that bit of background information and say, well, look, if we choose our nozzles correctly and cut down the fraction, we can reduce our risk a little bit, but essentially the conditions when the person or the operator is spraying will dictate what can happen in terms of product moving off site. So there's a number of factors in terms of weather that I've listed. One is what the product label says is mandatory. I can't change that, neither can the operator. So if there's a minimum or a maximum wind speed requirement, then that's a legal requirement. If people go outside of that, then they're actually off-label and on their own. The next point I put there is wind speed and wind direction. I think they're the most important factors for determining what's going to happen with the spray and whether conditions are suitable. We have the combination of temperature and humidity, which we tend to talk about as calling delta T, which is the difference between a wet bulb and a dry bulb thermometer reading. Release height and speed, and again that will be affected by the spray quality. And then some local weather effects. So this is the sort of stuff that can happen overnight and early in the morning, and it'll be different in different catchments. So I'll go through each of those. The first thing I mentioned before is that everyone needs to be able to measure the conditions where they're spraying. If they can't make them, can't make measurements, and they can't make a good decision. Now during the day, I think every load, if you can visually see what's happening outside, is probably enough. But at night things can happen so quickly, the weather can change dramatically, that you may need to consider something like an onboard weather station. The one on the right down the bottom there is a portable one that's fitted to the sprayer. It actually has a built-in GPS and will give the operator wind speed, direction, temperature, humidity live while they're driving, and has the ability to record that for them as well. So we are getting better instrumentation, and a lot of growers are getting access to some of these things now. Now in terms of wind speeds, we mentioned a maximum wind speed shouldn't be above 20, and that's an average. In some instances probably around 15 would be better if there's less ground cover. I think higher wind speed is much easier to manage from a spraying point of view, particularly where you have a canopy to catch droplets, and that's the sort of situation where you guys are going to be placing your bees. The canopy or the foliage tends to act as a surface to catch the droplets. So with that you can actually control how far things will move downwind, and the more surface area you have the better, but also having things like vegetative buffers, if they're porous and allow the air to move through, they'll reduce how far things can move downwind. So during the day the minimum wind speed should be about 3 to 4 to get the air mixing, kilometres per hour that is, but at night as the ground cools, it takes a lot more air movement to get the air mixing to bring droplets back down. So wind speeds above 11 to 12 is generally what's required at night, particularly between sunset and sunrise. And I'll talk a little bit more about this as we go. So as the air moves across the surface, there's two things that we normally know: that wind speed increases with height, and that temperature reduces with height. That's a normal situation. But the friction or the roughness of the ground will have an effect on that. So as air moves across the surface, it'll be slowest close to the ground. It'll increase with height. Within about 10 metres of the ground, the higher speed air will feed into the lower speed air, creating a rolling pattern or turbulence. And turbulence is increased when you get heat in the ground. So if we have a fairly smooth surface like the top example on fallow ground, if I leave some droplets in the air, they'll travel further before they come back down, and I'll have less things to catch them. In the second example, if I've got some heavy stubble there, it'll actually help increase the turbulence, and I've got a bit of a capture surface below, so less can leave the paddock. And then when I've got an in-crop situation, there's going to be a lot more deposition in-crop as the wind moves across it, and less potential for things to leave the field. So as I said, higher wind speeds are easy to manage, but particularly where you've got a canopy there to capture the droplets, it will reduce how far they can move downwind. So if you were locating a hive, you'd want to look at the predominant wind direction at a site and say, well, look, I really don't want to be directly downwind from that site. The other thing I want to talk about is inversion conditions. Now, if you looked at any sort of publications on inversions, you'll see graphs that look like this. What we're trying to show is, on the left, the normal situation where it's hotter near the ground, and as you get higher up the temperature decreases. That's because essentially the air is clear and you can't heat the air directly, so the air changes temperature by being in contact with the ground. So when the ground's hot, the air next to the ground will be hottest, and as I get further away or higher up, it'll be cooler. At night, when the ground cools, it'll cool the air next to it first. So you still have the same sort of profile of reducing with height, it's just that the temperature near the ground will be cooler than some height above it. And with the surface temperature inversion, usually we're talking about 40 to 60 metres from the ground surface overnight. So it's overnight, as the ground cools, the temperature near the surface will be a little bit lower than it is higher up, and then it goes back to the normal profile. And you can see in the right hand side that we've got a cooler surface, and then up to a height about a third way up, it actually appears to increase, and then it's back to the normal profile. So when that situation sets in, particularly overnight, you might see something like, or the example we've got next time in the next slide here. So on the left we have a typical daytime solution. The red line is trying to show temperature decreasing with height, but also wind speed with the black arrows increasing with height. Then on the right, when an inversion sets in, you'll see that it's trying to show that temperature increases with height and then reduces, and we have an inversion layer established. And this can actually cut us off from our weather pattern winds. So the winds, the weather pattern winds haven't stopped, they're just going over the top of the area because the inversion acts almost like a glass ceiling. And then what happens beneath the inversion layer in that brown area really is a local effect that will be driven by the landscape and how the landscape interacts with the weather pattern. So in the next couple of slides I've just gone through a 24-hour cycle as some of the things that can happen with weather overnight, and why it's very difficult to predict where things will go, and why it's dangerous for spraying. So we're thinking on a big scale here, synoptic winds or weather pattern winds during the daytime. For example, they're moving from left to right, and over on the right I'm meant to be showing the ocean there. We've got a big mountain range there, and then we've got some river systems inland. So we're talking, hundreds of kilometres here. Now late in the afternoon, quite often the wind speed appears to drop, and that's because we've got a high level inversion setting in, cutting us off from the weather pattern wind. Then what happens beneath that inversion will depend on where you are. So within 300 to 400 kilometres of the coast, you may actually get a sea breeze kicking in late in the afternoon, early evening, and that's generally going to be driven by differences in temperature. So when the sea breeze kicks in, it's usually because the land temperature is hotter than the water temperature, and it creates a circulation. So I'm trying to show an example of circulation here where the land temperature on the right is hotter. We got air raising up, and it drags air in from across the water from left to right, and you get this circulation happening near the coast. As I said, when the land temperature is hotter than the water temperature, that will drive that, but when they tend to equalise, it'll stop later at night. In fact, early in the morning, you'll get land breezes when the water's temperature is warmer than the land, that the air will actually flow back the other way. So in some areas we get a sea breeze circulation, but if that inversion layer, which I've shown with the red dotted line, actually falls below the height of the mountains, it could be isolated on the coast at some point. So either land temperature, water temperature equalises and the sea breeze stops, or it may be isolated on the coastal side by an inversion which is trapped under. The other thing that can happen with larger mountains and hills is this synoptic or weather pattern wind can be diverted back under the inversion. You get quite strong winds. Particularly around the Moree, Namoi sort of area, you get winds like this happening back off the Great Divide, and it can happen in other locations as well. So you can get quite strong winds blowing back in the opposite direction or a different direction to what you thought you'd have during the day, early to middle parts of the evening. And this is an example of the wind directions out for about 100-150 k's from the Great Divide overnight. This is from Graham Tepper, who wrote the weather book. So you can see on the left hand side there that they're basically westerly winds, but as you move closer to the range they're getting a more southerly component, and then right off the range they're actually coming from the east. So wind direction at night is very difficult to predict, and will be different in different locations and quite different to the synoptic or weather pattern situation. And these will last some time. This graph is an example showing some wind directions overnight. This is in summer between, Moree, Narrabri sort of area. And it goes from 3 p.m. in black through one afternoon through to 3 p.m. the next afternoon. So we'll focus on the black lines first. They're dotted, and it has wind speed written next to it. So near Narrabri, the black line's coming from the southwest at about 7 kilometres an hour. Moree sort of southwest at 11, Inverell at about 11. And then if we go to 3 a.m. you can see that at Moree that's swung almost 180 degrees. So that's the wind coming back off the ranges initially. At Inverell it's gone 270 degrees, and that's because of the range that travels down the right hand side and then across the bottom. The really important bit that I want people to look at is the 3 a.m, 6 a.m, 9 a.m. So start with Moree. At 3 a.m. it's coming basically directly from the east, then it moves sort of east-northeast and then to northeast from 11, 13 and 9 kilometres. So what it's doing is shifting to the left or anti-clockwise. If you look at Inverell, from 3 a.m. to 9 a.m. it's done the same thing, and the same thing at Narrabri. So wind direction overnight will shift to the left. That happens under the inversion anywhere in the southern hemisphere. In the northern hemisphere it actually swaps to the right. So if someone's spraying at night in those hours leading up to sunrise in particular, they've got to anticipate that there will be a wind direction shift. Particularly when the wind speeds are around that 12 kilometres an hour or less. That will be something that happens every night. And those winds at that speed are now drainage winds, what we call katabatic winds. So it's cool air slipping down off the slopes and moving across the floodplain. It can move quite quickly in some areas, but this sort of wind doesn't mix like the daytime wind does. It moves more parallel to the ground. So after midnight until sometimes after sunrise, you should expect that the wind will be more laminar or parallel to the ground. And that's what I'm trying to show in the next diagram, that the inversion layers set in still a higher level, and we've got some drainage coming down off the slopes towards the lowest points in the catchments. So cold air drainage at night will behave just like water. It'll move to the lowest points. Now if you're locating hives along rivers or in lower points in the catchment, this is where any chemical that's left in the air will tend to pool and drain. So being right next to a watercourse is probably one of the worst places you could put stuff, because in the morning that'll tend to sit there until the inversion breaks. And this air at night can separate out into layers or laminates, and the small droplets that they do get up there can remain trapped in that. And you've probably seen examples of this happen with fog. So in this example it may be a little bit difficult to see, but there are 3 layers of fog there. This is actually down Victoria to the Rappelese Mountains on the way from Warwick-Nabil out to Keith. But what I want you to do is see those 3 layers of air. If you imagine moving to the right a couple of kilometres and within about half an hour, I'll just move next slide. They're the same 3 layers of air. And what's happened is the water droplets within those layers of air has concentrated. And it's actually sitting in a lower point in the catchment. And that could cause damage to that crop. But that will actually sit there and it'll break until, sit there until the inversion breaks, which typically will occur after the sun's gotten up. So an inversion will break from the ground up the same way fog disappears, and you'll only ever get fog when you've got a surface temperature inversion. And this is a classic example, although if we didn't have the water vapor or water droplets in the air, it'd be harder to see, but those layers of air would still be there. And if any spraying's done overnight, it can get trapped in layers like this and end up in lower points of the catchment. And that's really high risk. It's when we tend to see a lot of damage from spray drift, particularly with herbicides, things like that. But obviously insecticides at night, if they're moving onto a crop, this could be airborne and may not break while bees are foraging, or it could end up where you've actually located the hives if they're in a low point in the catchment. I just want to give you an example of a trial I did a couple of summers ago now, back in 2011, and we sprayed basically at 2 times, at 2:30 in the evening and then again at 7:30 in the morning after the sun had come up. This was done with a 36 metre boom at 22 kilometres an hour. We sprayed a 55 hectare block with coarse spray quality, which is pretty good for drift management. We measured what landed in the paddock, which is represented by the rectangular blue box there. And then downwind of it we also collected what was landing on the ground. We had a tower that was 20 metres high where we run fishing line vertically to catch the airborne fraction. So we compare what's landing and what's in the air downwind of the sprayed site. So this graph's just showing the conditions at night and during the day. So at night we had a 11.5 kilometre an hour wind, so this would have been legal for the APVMA requirements, and during the day it was 18.3. What we were trying to do is match temperature and humidity as much as we could in this trial to make sure that droplet survival was fairly equal. And the graph below is showing the proportion of the spray that was still remaining airborne at 80 metres downwind from the edge of the sprayed paddock. So during the day that was about 0.3% of the applied rate. At night that was 1.6% of what we put out stayed in the air at 80 metres. If you ever think about that, when we're doing 60 hectares per hour, that's 1 hectare's worth of chemical remaining airborne. The other thing that's quite scary is that the daytime spraying, most of that had settled on the ground within about 300 to 400 metres downwind. With the nighttime spraying, there was very little on the ground after 100 metres, so what was in the air was tending to stay in the air, and it was moving away from the spray site at about 11 k's an hour. You ever think about that, that's a lot of chemical remaining airborne, and if it ends up in the wrong place, which will typically be in the lower parts of the catchment, there's quite a bit of risk from that. This next slide actually shows the deposits on that vertical tower. So on the left hand vertical axis we've got height going up to about 20 metres, and across the bottom it's just showing a percentage of the applied rate on the string. I just want to show this comparison between day and night essentially. So the blue bars are the daytime spraying, and so up to about 7 metres we were catching a bit, but in lower amounts, and there was a little bit higher up, which I think came from directly behind the sprayer. But the red bars are showing how much more is remaining in the air within that 10 to 14 metres of the ground, and moving parallel. So night spraying is much higher risk from a drift point of view and for product moving off site. And where it ends up, as I said, typically the cold air will drain to the lower points in the catchments, and these are typically areas where we'll see a lot of localised damage, but it's an area where I just think I'd be very careful about beehives. And when we get an area where there's a lot of people spraying, I tend to call it community drift, where if there's predicted to be a break in the weather, everyone tries to go out and get some work done before a front comes through, particularly if it's fungicides and things like that, or some insecticides, and they all leave their little bit in the air. Where's that likely to end up? If you looked at areas where flooding was likely to occur, there's the same sort of places where you'd expect a lot of damage to occur in terms of from spray drift, either crop damage or other things. So most applicators need to know what's around them, and most people immediately think about the sensitive crop. The label will ask them to think about things like houses and aquatic areas, but nowhere on the label with the new no spray zones does it mention specifically things for beehives. So you guys need to be aware of what's going to be sprayed, but where things could possibly move. If I was going to locate hives on this side, the river would be an area that I'd actually try and avoid, because I know it's typically going to be the lower point in the catchments where things will drain a bit more. Generally you want to be on the upwind, but also at a higher part of the paddock or a higher elevation than most of the sprayed areas wherever possible. The other thing I mentioned was delta T, or conditions for spraying. Now there's been a lot of talk about this with growers. There's a chart below which is kind of like a traffic light system. We've got humidity up on the left axis, temperature across the bottom, and a lot of times we've been told not to spray when it's too hot, and so people trying to stick in that chart will knock off very early in the morning and come back at night. Now this might be good for while there's foraging, but from a drift point of view it's actually been quite disastrous, because as you increase droplet size from a drift point of view, you can probably push quite a bit further during the day. So normally with fine droplets we talk about staying in that green area. If we've got larger droplets, then we might increase that delta T down to about 10 or 12. This means that people can do a little more spraying during the day if it's relatively safe, and try and cut back the hours they're doing at night, particularly those times after midnight where there's a lot of risk. The other thing I'd encourage growers to do, and you guys might be able to have a look at this as well, as some of the planning tools that give you a bit of an overview of weather coming up. Obviously you can get your Bureau of Meteorology mediagrams, but there's also a couple of other sites that help operators plan their spraying. One example would be the New Farm Spraywise site that it gives you all the weather details, but also give you a 5-day outlook for when conditions are going to be suitable for spraying. But they'll also give you wind speed and wind direction. So if I had hives and I knew that someone was going to be spraying adjacent to them, I'd want them to be logging on to something like this to give them an idea of when's going to be the best time and the safest time for spraying over the next week. The website address is there at the top. If you want to check it out, you can get a 7-day free trial. Otherwise they charge you about $120 a year for 5 locations. But for a corporate one, for $250 a year, I think I can get 20 locations where I can get access to it. And if you've got 20 positions where you've got hives, you might actually be able to locate those and give the grower the access or password to have a look in and look at the weather, so you can actually plan what's coming up, and hopefully they won't damage your hives or something like that. The other thing is the use of mapping systems. I know we have Bee Alert. I thought Cotton Map from a drift point of view and a crop damage has been excellent, because if people can look up where the sensitive areas are. Generally they will, and it helps reduce damage. I think we need to make much better use of the bee alerts. I saw a system in Nebraska which was really good, in that when you moved your hives and you put your GPS position in, it would basically send a text message to anyone that was registered with the system who had crops or whatever around it, and let them know where they were. Now obviously there's risks associated with potential theft or vandalism, things like that you need to be aware of. But if people don't know where the hives are, they can't do anything about reducing the risk if spray is moving towards them. So in summary, there's a number of things that affect drift potential. Obviously the weather's the most important one, so when people decide to spray, there's a lot they can do with nozzle design to cut down the risk, but the damage that can be done is going to be a matter of product choice, and also adjuvants in there and how the machine is operated. So in the resource packs that are available there's a whole heap of information. There's all the sort of fact sheets and weather books and stuff on adjuvants and things that we normally give out in workshops. And I'd be keen, if I get an opportunity, to come back and talk to you guys in the future, just to give you a little more detail and perhaps be able to answer questions. Obviously I'm sorry I couldn't be there today. I've got another meeting in Melbourne. If you need to contact me, my details will be on most of those fact sheets in the folders, or have a chat to Bryn. We'll get in contact and we'll try and arrange something. Maybe next year I'll get back to one of your conferences. Okay, thanks guys.